He said, "My code was legacy baggage." An interesting choice of words from a man who inherited a kingdom he didn't know how to rule. My name is Aubrey, and for 3 years, I was the lead architect of our company's flagship software. Ether wasn't just a program to me, it was a living, breathing thing. I had laid every brick, wired every circuit, and taught it how to think. Then the board, in its infinite and often misguided wisdom, brought in Micah. He was slick, with a smile that never reached his eyes and a vocabulary built entirely from business school platitudes. He saw me, with my decade of experience and my deep knowledge of the system's bones, as a relic, a ghost in the machine he now owned. In his first week, he reassigned me to a project so pointless, so utterly devoid of a future, that they called it Project Sundown. It was a digital retirement home for obsolete code, and I was its first and only resident. Then came the press release. I saw it on a public news feed before I even got the internal memo. Innovate Corp announces Ether 3.0, a quantum leap forward, spearheaded by CEO Micah Thorne. He took full credit. My work, my sleepless nights, my breakthroughs, all of it distilled into a smirking headshot and a quote about his vision for a new era. He promised investors and clients a major update he planned to launch in a month. An update built on the very core I designed. What he doesn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, is that the core algorithm of Ether has a heart, and that heart is locked. It's protected by a private encryption key, a sort of digital dead man's switch that only I control. The revolutionary update he's been promising the world cannot launch without it. And he just put the one person on this planet who can help him on notice. If you've ever poured your soul into something only to have someone else try and steal it, then you know this feeling. It's a cold fire in the pit of your stomach. Let me know in the comments if you've been there, because it helps to know I'm not just screaming into the void. The announcement hit me not like a tidal wave, but like the silent, pressure-building descent into the deep ocean. I was sitting at my desk, the same desk where I'd sketched out the initial framework for Ether on a stack of napkins years ago. The email from corporate communications blinked onto my screen, a sterile white rectangle of text. It was a foreword of the press release, with a boilerplate intro. Team, exciting news to share about the future of our company. Team, the word felt like a deliberate insult. I read Micah's quote again. We are shedding the legacy constraints of the past to embrace a more dynamic and forward-thinking architecture. Legacy constraints. He was talking about me. He was talking about my work. My mind flashed to a conversation we'd had in his second week. He'd called me into his new office, which still smelled of fresh paint and expensive leather. It was a sterile glass box overlooking the entire open-plan floor where my team worked. He didn't ask me to sit. He leaned against his ridiculously large mahogany desk, holding a tablet, and swiped through a presentation. He talked about synergy and disruption and paradigm shifts. I just stood there, waiting for him to say something of substance. Finally, he looked up, his eyes skimming over me as if I were a piece of outdated hardware. He said, "Your team has done some solid foundational work, Aubrey, but it's time to bring in fresh blood, fresh ideas. We can't be held back by old methodologies." I had tried to explain. I said, "Micah, the architecture isn't old, it's resilient. It's designed to be scalable and secure, not just flashy. The core tenets of good software design don't become obsolete." He just smiled that empty smile. He said, "I appreciate your perspective. We'll be sure to keep it in mind as we move forward." The next day, he announced a new Tiger team to lead the Ether 3.0 initiative. My name wasn't on the list. Instead, he had promoted a handful of junior developers, people who were good but inexperienced, and put them under the direction of a new manager he'd brought in from his old company. My team, the people I had personally mentored and trained, were scattered to other departments. And me, I was given Project Sundown. My new office was in the basement. It wasn't really an office, more of a glorified storage closet with a window that looked out onto a concrete retaining wall. The air was stale, thick with the smell of old paper and dust. My task was to document and prepare a handful of ancient, unused modules for decommissioning. It was the corporate equivalent of being sent to a Siberian salt mine. It was a clear, unambiguous message. You are no longer relevant. You are already gone. You just haven't left the building yet. And now this press release. It wasn't just that he was taking credit, it was the way he was erasing me. He was positioning my meticulous, careful work as a problem that he, the great savior, had solved. The irony was so thick, I could barely breathe. The quantum leap he was promising was a series of features I had personally designed and prototyped over the last 18 months. He had found my project files on the server, repackaged them with a new user interface, and was calling it his own revolution. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it was breathtaking. My fingers hovered over my keyboard. I felt a surge of white-hot anger, the impulse to write a company-wide email, to expose him for the fraud he was. But my professionalism, the same quality he was now using as a weapon against me, held me back. It's a funny thing, professional restraint. It's a virtue until someone uses it to build your coffin. I closed the email. I looked at the gray concrete wall that was my new horizon. The cold fire in my stomach began to cool, condensing into something harder, heavier, and infinitely more dangerous. It was resolve. He thought he had buried me. He didn't realize he had just planted a seed. The drive home was a blur. I remember the red tail lights of the cars in front of me bleeding into the rain-slicked asphalt, the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers, counting out a beat of my own internal rhythm. Betrayed, erased, ignored. Betrayed, erased, ignored. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence in the car was a physical presence, a heavy blanket I pulled around myself. When I got to my apartment, I didn't turn on the lights. I walked through the familiar darkness to the living room window and just stood there, watching the city lights glitter through the rain. This was my low point. The moment where the professional mask crumbles and the raw human cost of it all comes flooding in. My mind, unbidden, replayed a highlight reel of my own loyalty, not just to the company, but to the idea of the company, the dream it was supposed to be. I remembered the beginning, 7 years ago, when Innovate Corp was just a handful of people in a cramped office above a coffee shop. The founder, David Chen, was a visionary. He wasn't a slick CEO. He was a brilliant, wild-haired engineer with a passion that was infectious. He saw the potential for Ether, a platform that could revolutionize data management for an entire industry. He hired me not as an employee, but as a partner. He'd look at my whiteboard scribbles, his eyes wide with excitement, and say, "Aubrey, that's it. That's the key." We built Ether together, fueled by cheap pizza, stale coffee, and a shared belief that we were creating something important. We worked 18-hour days. We argued over algorithmic efficiency and database architecture until we were hoarse. It was the most challenging and the most rewarding work of my life. I remember one night, about a year in, we were on the verge of a breakthrough with the core data pipeline. It was 3 in the morning. We were both exhausted. I was ready to give up, to go home and try again in the morning. But David sat down next to me, pointed at a complex line of code on the screen, and said, "Look closer. The elegance is there. We just have to find it." We found it an hour later. That moment, that shared victory in the quiet, pre-dawn hours of a Tuesday, was the soul of the company. That was the soul I had dedicated myself to protecting. Then David got sick. It was sudden, aggressive, and cruel. He fought it for a year, trying to run the company from his hospital bed, but eventually he had to step away. He sold his controlling interest to a venture capital firm with the understanding that they would honor his vision, his ethos. The board they installed paid lip service to it. They kept me on as lead architect, a living link to the company's founding principles. But their priorities were different. They didn't care about elegant code. They cared about quarterly earnings reports. They didn't understand that the former created the latter. The culture began to change, slowly at first, then all at once. It was 1,000 tiny paper cuts. A marketing manager changing the name of a feature I'd spent 6 months developing without consulting me. My budget requests for infrastructure upgrades being denied in favor of a new, flashy office renovation. Male colleagues presenting my ideas in meetings as their own, and when I tried to correct the record, I'd be met with polite, dismissive smiles. I was told I wasn't a team player. I stayed through it all. Why? That's the question people always ask. Why do you stay in a place that's slowly killing you? For me, it was a misguided sense of duty. I felt like I was the guardian of David's legacy. If I left, the last piece of the company's original soul would leave with it. I told myself it wasn't about me. I was protecting Ether. It was a noble justification for what was, in hindsight, a deep-seated fear of letting go of the thing I had built. My identity was so intertwined with that code that I couldn't imagine myself without it. So, I endured. I became the quiet, reliable foundation that everyone took for granted. The one who would stay late to fix the problems created by their reckless, short-sighted decisions. Micah's arrival was the culmination of this slow decay. He was the physical embodiment of the new culture. He was all surface, no depth. He spoke in buzzwords and managed by spreadsheet. He saw the intricate, powerful engine of Ether not as a marvel of engineering, but as a black box that produced revenue. He didn't care how it worked, as long as he could put his name on the outside of it. He saw me, the architect, as a complication. I knew things he didn't. I understood things he couldn't. In his world, that didn't make me valuable. It made me a threat. So he did what men like him always do. He sought to neutralize the threat not by learning from it, but by isolating and silencing it. And so here I was, standing in my dark apartment, the full weight of my foolish loyalty crashing down on me. I had stayed to protect the castle, and now the new king had banished me to the dungeon and was planning a parade in my honor. The humiliation was a physical ache in my chest. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, hot and sharp. It was the first one I had allowed myself to shed. I let it fall, then another. I wasn't crying for my job. I was grieving. I was grieving for the company that was, for the dream that had been corrupted, and for the part of myself I had sacrificed on its altar. As I stood there, lost in the fog of my own despair, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The screen cast a pale blue light into the darkness. I almost ignored it. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't want to hear, "I'm so sorry," or "That's so unfair," but something made me walk over and pick it up. It was a secure message from Chloe. Chloe was my protégée. I had hired her straight out of college 4 years ago. She was quiet, brilliant, and had a natural talent for coding that was a rare and beautiful thing to see. I saw a younger version of myself in her, full of passion and idealism. I took her under my wing, mentored her, and watched her grow into a phenomenal developer. She was one of the few people Micah's Tiger team had kept on, likely because she was young female, and he thought she would be easy to control. Her message was short, cryptic. It read, "Aubrey, I can't find the primary encryption manifest for the core data pipeline. Micah wants it for the final integration, and the launch is in 2 weeks. The documentation tree has a dead link. He's asking aggressive questions. He's starting to get loud." I stared at the message, the words glowing in the dark. The encryption manifest, the dead link. Of course the link was dead. It was designed to be. It was a pointer to something that didn't live on their servers. The fog in my head began to clear. The grief and humiliation receded, replaced by something else. A quiet, cold clarity. A single crystalline thought formed in my mind. He can't do it. Without me, he can't do it. Chloe's message was the catalyst. It was the spark that ignited the cold, hard resolve that had been forming in my gut. This was no longer just about me and my stolen credit. It was about the integrity of the system itself. Micah, in his arrogant haste, was about to perform open-heart surgery on Ether with a butter knife and a manual he hadn't read. He was going to break it, and he was going to blame Chloe and the other junior developers when he did. He would ruin their careers to save his own skin. I had seen his type before. They always need a scapegoat. I thought of David. I thought of his obsession with elegance and resilience. And I thought about the conversation we'd had 5 years ago after a competitor suffered a catastrophic security breach. An engineer on his way out the door had planted a logic bomb in their system. It had cost them millions and nearly bankrupted them. The next day, David had called me into his office. He was pale. He said, "We need a failsafe. We need a way to protect the core logic of Ether, its very heart, from being compromised. Not just from the outside, but from the inside." From someone with legitimate credentials who decides to do something stupid or malicious. That was the day we designed the Keystone Protocol. It was my idea, born from a deep-seated architectural belief in checks and balances. It wasn't about setting a trap. It was about creating a final manual airlock for the system's most critical functions. Any change to the core data pipeline, the very engine of Ether, required a two-part authentication. The first part was a standard software key stored on the company's servers. The second part was a physical key, an asymmetric private encryption key stored on a hardware token, an offline device that looked like a simple USB stick. To deploy a core update, you needed both. The software key could be accessed by the system administrator. The hardware key, the keystone, was in my possession. It was a principle of two-man control, like a nuclear launch sequence. It was designed to prevent exactly what Micah was trying to do, a reckless unilateral change to the system's foundation. We documented it, of course. We weren't trying to be secretive. The full documentation for the Keystone Protocol was printed, signed by both David and me, and sealed in a thick manila envelope. That envelope was filed with the company's legal counsel and stored in a physical safe. The protocol dictated that the envelope could only be opened with a written joint instruction from the CEO and the lead architect. It was a break glass in case of war measure. David had looked at me when we locked the safe. He said, "Hopefully, no one ever has to read this. But I'll sleep better knowing it's there. You're the guardian of the architecture, Aubrey. Never forget that." Micah, in his hubris, had never bothered with the deep-level architectural documents. He was a man who read the cover of the book and thought he understood the story. He had seen the first half of the lock, the software key, and assumed that was all there was. He had no idea that the real door was still bolted shut. It wasn't a dead man's switch in the malicious sense. It wasn't designed to destroy anything. It was designed to preserve, to prevent the system from being updated incorrectly. It was in essence a lock that could only be opened by someone who truly understood what they were doing. And Micah didn't have a clue. This is the point where people might say, my failure to make the Keystone Protocol more widely known was a logical flaw. Why keep such a critical piece of information so restricted? Was it paranoia? A desire for control? The truth is, it was a decision based on a specific kind of corporate reality. In a world of high employee turnover and shifting corporate priorities, David and I believed that the ultimate security of the system's core should not be subject to the whims of a new manager or a temporary policy. It needed a human guardian, a steward who was tied to the history and philosophy of the architecture. It was an emotional choice, a belief in human responsibility over automated process, and people can debate its logic all day long. For me, it was a promise I made to David. My fingers flew across my phone's keyboard. I typed a reply to Chloe. I kept it professional, detached. Chloe, the documentation for all core protocols should be in the central repository under the Genesis project folder. If it's not there, there might be a server indexing issue. I would suggest you file a formal IT ticket and escalate the issue to your direct supervisor. I'm no longer assigned to the Ether project, so I can't provide any direct assistance. Best, Aubrey. It was a perfectly crafted piece of corporate non-help. I gave her just enough information to send her down the right path. The Genesis folder was where the early, high-level architectural decisions were logged, but I knew what she would find there. A reference to the Keystone Protocol, but not the protocol itself. It would mention a physical key and a legal document. It would be a dead end, but a very informative one. It would lead her, and by extension Micah, into a maze of their own corporate bureaucracy, and it absolved me of any responsibility. I was just a helpful former colleague, pointing her toward the proper channels. I then did something else. I went to my laptop and opened a browser. For years I had kept the domain name for Ethereal Consulting LLC, registered but dormant. It was a someday plan, a life raft I never thought I'd need. I spent the next 2 hours filling out the online forms to officially incorporate the business. I paid the fee with my personal credit card. It was a small, quiet act of rebellion. I was no longer just Aubrey, the demoted architect. I was Aubrey, founder and CEO of my own company. It was just a legal shell for now, a company with no clients and no revenue, but it was mine. It was a foundation. I was building my own parachute while Micah was busy sawing off the branch we were both sitting on. The next few days were a masterclass in quiet observation. I went to my basement office. I worked on Project Sundown, methodically and meticulously documenting code that nobody would ever use again. I was a model employee. I answered emails promptly. I was polite and professional. I was a ghost, haunting the periphery of the company, completely invisible to the unfolding drama happening on the floors above me. But I had a window into that world. Her name was Chloe. Her messages became my private news feed, a real-time account of the rising tide of panic. Found the reference in the Genesis files, she wrote the next day. It mentions a keystone and a sealed document with legal. Micah went down there. They told him they need your signature to open it. He came back, red in the face. He just slammed his office door. I could picture it perfectly. Micah, the master of the universe, being told by a paralegal that he couldn't access a file without the permission of the woman he just exiled to the basement. The beautiful, exquisite irony of it. It wasn't about revenge, I told myself as a small smile touched my lips. It was about the system working as designed. I started to think about my own leverage, beyond the key. The keystone was my ace in the hole, but a true victory required more than just one good card. It required a strategic position on the entire board. My real leverage wasn't just code, it was trust. Specifically, the trust of our clients. For years, I had been the face of Ether's technical stability. When a major client had a complex integration issue, they didn't call the sales team. They called me. I had built personal relationships based on competence and honesty. My mind drifted to one client in particular, Arthur Sterling, the chief technology officer of a massive financial services firm, Sterling and Finch. They were our biggest client, accounting for nearly 30% of our annual revenue. Arthur was old school. He was a gruff, no-nonsense man in his late 60s who had forgotten more about technology than Micah would ever know. He hated corporate platitudes and could smell a fraud from a mile away. He and I had a relationship built on mutual respect. We had spent hours on late-night calls, troubleshooting complex data migration issues. He didn't trust Innovate Corp. He trusted me. I remembered a conversation we'd had a year ago, over lunch. He'd been complaining about our new account manager, a slick young salesman who clearly didn't understand their needs. Arthur had looked at me over the rim of his water glass and said, "Aubrey, you're the only reason we're still with this company. You're the firewall. The day you leave is the day I instruct my team to begin a full migration to a competitor. I need you to know that." At the time, I had been flattered, but also a little uncomfortable. It felt like too much responsibility. Now I realized what it was. It was power. I opened my personal email and drafted a message. It was short, simple, and professional. "Dear Arthur," I wrote, "I hope this message finds you well. I'm writing to let you know that I have recently transitioned into a new role within Innovate Corp, focusing on legacy systems. While I'm no longer involved in the day-to-day development of the Ether platform, I want to thank you for your partnership over the years. It has been a pleasure working with you and your team. All the best, Aubrey." I didn't complain. I didn't badmouth Micah. I simply stated the facts. But I knew how Arthur would read it. He would understand the subtext immediately. Transition to a new role focusing on legacy systems. He would know that meant I had been sidelined. I was planting a seed of doubt. I was laying a quiet, invisible tripwire. I hit send. The next day, Chloe's message was more frantic. They tried to bypass the protocol. They brought in an external security consultant. He spent 6 hours trying to find a vulnerability in the core authentication module. He said the encryption is hermetically sealed and trying to brute force it would risk catastrophic data corruption. Micah paid him $10,000 to be told no. Now the whole Tiger team is in a conference room, and Micah is yelling about insubordinations and unacceptable roadblocks. I felt a grim satisfaction. Micah was throwing money and anger at a problem that required intellect and humility, two things he was sorely lacking. He was like a man trying to open a bank vault by yelling at it. I wrote back to Chloe. That sounds stressful. Remember to document everything. Every meeting, every directive, create a paper trail. It's always good practice. I was teaching her how to protect herself. I was giving her the tools to survive the fallout that was inevitably coming. This, I realized, was the core of my plan. It wasn't a single dramatic act of sabotage. It was a quiet campaign of strategic incompetence on their part, facilitated by my strategic competence. I didn't have to do anything malicious. All I had to do was step back and let Micah's arrogance do the work for me. He had built a house of cards on my solid foundation, and I was simply refusing to hold it up for him any longer. The wind was picking up, and the whole thing was about to come tumbling down. And I had my little consulting company, my parachute, ready and waiting. This wasn't about revenge. It was about creating a new reality, one where competence was valued over charisma, and where the architect finally got to own the blueprint. The countdown to the launch date became a slow-motion train wreck that I watched from a safe distance. The official launch was scheduled for a Friday. By the preceding Monday, the atmosphere in the company had shifted from frantic optimism to a thick, palpable dread. I could feel it even down in my basement hermitage. The hum of the servers seemed to have a nervous edge. The air, usually just stale, now felt charged with ozone, like the moment before a lightning strike. Chloe's messages were now a constant stream, a running commentary on the collapse. They're trying to roll back to the previous version, but Micah is refusing. He told the board the update is on track and that any delays are just final security enhancements. He's lying to everyone. Another message an hour later, he called an all-hands meeting for the Ether team. He accused us of not being agile enough. He said we lacked synergistic vision. I think he used the word synergies 12 times. No one knows what it means. On Tuesday, Micah finally broke. He sent me an email directly. The subject line was a single stark word, "You Argent." The body was a masterpiece of barely concealed panic, dressed up in corporate command speak. "Aubrey," it read, "it has come to my attention that you are in possession of a security asset vital to the Ether 3.0 launch. Your lack of cooperation up to this point is being noted. You are instructed to deliver the master encryption key for the core pipeline to my office by noon today. This is a matter of critical company priority." I read the email 3 times. He was still giving orders. Even in his desperation, his arrogance was a reflex. He didn't ask, he instructed. He didn't seek to understand. He sought to command. He was framing my adherence to a security protocol I had co-designed with the company's founder as a lack of cooperation. It was a classic managerial tactic: redefine the problem so that it becomes someone else's fault. I looked at the clock on my screen. It was 9:04 a.m. I had just under 3 hours until his deadline. I didn't reply. I continued my work on Project Sundown. I documented a particularly useless piece of code from 2008. I made a cup of tea. I let the silence stretch. I knew that every passing minute of my silence would be an eternity of screaming panic for him. This wasn't just a negotiation anymore. This was a psychological game. He had tried to break me with isolation and humiliation. Now I was breaking him with silence and competence. At 11:58 a.m., 2 minutes before his deadline, my desk phone rang. It was an internal number I didn't recognize. I let it ring. It went to voicemail. A minute later, an email from his executive assistant popped up. "Micah Thorne requests your immediate presence in his office. Request." The language was softening. The armor was cracking. I still didn't move. I waited a full 24 hours. The next day, Wednesday, I finally crafted my reply to his "You Argent" email. I spent a long time on it, making sure every word was perfect. It had to be calm, professional, and utterly devastating in its polite refusal to play his game. "Dear Micah," I wrote, "thank you for your email. I'm not familiar with any master encryption keys as you describe it. All security protocols for the Ether platform were designed and documented in accordance with the standards set by the previous leadership. The architecture is built on a principle of dual control to ensure system integrity, as I'm sure your technical team has discovered. Perhaps you can point me to the specific documentation you're referring to, and I can try to help you understand it. As I am currently assigned to Project Sundown, my access to Ether's core systems is limited, per your directive. Best regards, Aubrey. It was perfect. I mentioned the previous leadership, a direct jab at his ego. I framed the problem as his lack of understanding, not my lack of cooperation, and the final sentence was the checkmate. I used his own directive, his own act of banishing me, as the reason I couldn't help him. I was maliciously complying with the exact situation he had created. I hit send and felt a profound sense of calm. I had just returned service with a shot he couldn't possibly return. The fallout was immediate. Chloe messaged me within the hour. He got your email, he read it on his monitor, and he just went still. Then he swept everything off his desk. His laptop, his papers, everything. It was dead silent for about 10 seconds, and then he just started shouting that he needed to speak to legal, to HR, to someone, anyone. The panic had breached containment. It was no longer confined to the Ether team. It was spreading through the executive wing, but Micah made one last, desperate move. He tried to control the narrative. On Thursday, less than 24 hours before the scheduled launch, the company's PR department pushed out a statement to the press. It announced a brief strategic delay in the launch of Ether 3.0 to incorporate additional next-generation security features to further enhance client data protection. It was a weak, transparent attempt to spin failure into a strength, but it was too late. The seeds of doubt I had planted were beginning to sprout. A tech journalist from a major industry publication, a woman I had briefed several times over the years and who respected my work, had already been sniffing around. She had sources within the company, old colleagues of mine who were still loyal to me and disgusted by Micah's behavior. Her article dropped that afternoon. The headline was brutal: Innovate Corp's Quantum Leap Hits a Wall. Insiders point to architectural gridlock and leadership failure. The article was a masterpiece of journalism. It didn't mention me by name, but it quoted anonymous senior engineers who spoke of a reckless development process and a new leadership team that is unfamiliar with the platform's core architecture. It mentioned the sidelined original architect of the system and hinted at a fundamental, unbreachable security protocol that had been ignored. It was a public vivisection of Micah's incompetence. The company's stock, which had risen on the hype of Ether 3.0, began to slide. The board, who had been placated by Micah's smooth talk and promises, started making calls. The silent takeover was no longer silent. The entire industry could now hear the sound of Micah's kingdom crumbling, and I hadn't raised my voice once. I had simply let the truth speak for itself. The Friday of the scheduled launch arrived, not with a bang, but with a deafening silence. There was no celebration, no triumphant press release, no self-congratulatory email from Micah. There was only the gaping void where a promise used to be. The stock price was in a free fall. The story of the failed launch was the lead item on every tech news site. My name was still not mentioned, but in the circles that mattered, everyone knew. They knew the architect had been sidelined, and they knew the structure had failed as a result. That morning, my personal cell phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I knew by heart. It was Arthur Sterling. His voice was exactly as I had imagined it would be, calm, direct, and devoid of any artifice. "Aubrey," he said, without any preamble. "I read the news. I also read between the lines of your email last week. What the hell is going on over there?" I took a deep breath. This was the moment. I could have unloaded. I could have told him everything, detailed every slight, every act of arrogance from Micah. But I didn't. That would have been emotional. This was business. "Arthur," I said, my voice even and professional. "There seem to be some challenges with the new leadership's technical transition plan. They've pursued a very aggressive timeline." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing, processing. An aggressive timeline, he repeated, his voice dripping with dry irony. Is that what they're calling it? It sounds more like they drove the car off a cliff because they didn't know where the brakes were. He paused again, then his tone sharpened. Let me ask you a direct question, Aubrey. Are you still committed to the integrity of that platform? This was the question I had been waiting for. This was the door opening. My commitment is to the integrity of the architecture, Arthur, I replied carefully, wherever that architecture may be. It was the perfect answer. It was loyal to the work, not the company. It was a declaration of independence. I see, he said. And I knew that he did. Thank you, Aubrey. That's all I needed to know. He hung up. 2 hours later, a press release from Sterling and Finch hit the wire. It was short and brutal. In light of recent events and concerns regarding platform stability and leadership, Sterling and Finch is immediately pausing its service with Innovate Corp, pending a full strategic review of our data management partnerships. It was an earthquake. The loss of their biggest client, stated so publicly and so coldly, turned the stock slide into a full-blown collapse. It was a vote of no confidence, not just in the Ether platform, but in Micah's entire leadership. And as I knew it would, it triggered a cascade. Within hours, two other major clients, who had always followed Sterling and Finch's lead, announced similar service pauses. The exodus had begun. They weren't just leaving a company, they were following an architect. The rest of the day was a blur of frantic energy that I observed from my quiet basement sanctuary. At 4 p.m., my desk phone, which hadn't rung in weeks, shrieked to life. It was Micah. I almost didn't answer, but my curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to hear it. I picked up the receiver. Aubrey, I said. His voice was unrecognizable. The arrogance, the condescension, the smooth corporate polish, it was all gone. All that was left was the raw, ragged sound of pure desperation. Aubrey, he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. Aubrey, we need to talk. I may have misjudged the situation. The board, the clients. This is a disaster. I said nothing. I just let him talk. Let the silence from my end amplify his panic. Listen, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. We can fix this. You and me. I'll give you anything you want. We'll create a new role for you. Vice President of Engineering. A 50% raise. A retention bonus. A massive one. Just name your price. Just tell me where the key is. We can put out a statement, say we found a last-minute bug, and that you led the team that fixed it. We can make you a hero. Just help me, Aubrey. Please. It was pathetic. He was offering me the very things, money, a title, that he thought I valued, because that's all he valued. He still didn't understand. He thought this was a transaction. He didn't realize it was a reckoning. I let the silence sit for a few more seconds, letting him squirm in it. Then I spoke, my voice low and calm. Micah, I said, the key isn't a thing you find in a drawer. It's a protocol. It represents a process that you have to earn the right to participate in. A process you chose to dismantle when you decided the architect was legacy baggage. I could hear his sharp intake of breath. You wanted to know where the documentation is, I continued, my voice unwavering. It's exactly where it's always been, in a sealed envelope in the company's legal safe. The protocol to open it requires a joint, signed instruction from the CEO and the lead architect. When you reassigned me to Project Sundown, you officially terminated my role as lead architect of Aether. My signature is no longer valid on that document. I let that sink in. I had just explained to him, in the calmest possible terms, that the vault was sealed forever, and he was the one who had thrown away the key. You put me on notice, Micah, I said, my voice dropping even lower, colder. You created this problem. You solve it. And with that, I gently placed the receiver back in its cradle, cutting off the sputtering, incoherent sounds of his defeat. The power had not just shifted, it had been reclaimed. The call from the board came on Monday morning. They didn't summon me to Micah's glass box office. They asked me to join them in the main boardroom, the one reserved for the most critical decisions. It was a long, dark room, dominated by a massive oak table that always felt like a prop from a movie about serious, important men. As I walked in, I saw that half the board was dialed in on a large screen, their faces a gallery of grim, worried expressions. The other half were there in person, seated around the table. At the far end, looking small and pale, was Micah. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at a fixed point on the polished surface of the table. The chairman of the board, a man named Mr. Harrison, whom I had met only a few times, gestured to an empty chair directly across from Micah. It was a deliberate symbolic placement. "Aubrey," he began, his voice heavy. "Thank you for joining us. As you are aware, the company is facing a significant crisis." I simply nodded, my hands folded calmly on the table in front of me. I didn't feel nervous. I felt a strange sense of peace. I was no longer a player in their game. I was here as a consultant, an expert being called in to assess the damage. "We have spent the weekend reviewing the architecture documents for the Ether platform," Harrison continued, gesturing to a stack of binders on the table, including the Genesis files and the legal brief on something called the Keystone Protocol. "We've also spoken to several senior engineers. It's become clear that there has been a fundamental misunderstanding of the system's core security features." He glanced at Micah, a look of pure, undiluted disappointment on his face. Micah visibly flinched. "Aubrey," Harrison said, turning back to me, "the board has one question for you. Can this be fixed?" I let the question hang in the air for a moment. I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each board member, one by one. Then my gaze finally settled on Micah. He was looking at me now, his expression a desperate, pleading mess. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and steady. "It can be fixed. The system is not broken. It is, in fact, working perfectly. The Keystone Protocol was not a bug. It was a feature. It was designed by myself and our founder, David Chen, to protect this company's most valuable asset from being compromised by reckless or uninformed actions. It was designed to prevent exactly what happened last week." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. "The system can be updated," I continued, "but only by following the proper, secure protocol. That protocol requires more than just a key. It requires a deep, institutional knowledge of the architecture. It requires trust, and it requires an architect." Harrison leaned forward. "And are you willing to be that architect, Aubrey? We are prepared to reinstate you, to offer you the Vice President of Engineering title that Micah mentioned. We will, of course, provide a substantial financial package to compensate you for this disruption." This was the moment of truth. The easy path was to say yes, to take the promotion, the money, the corner office, to reclaim my old position, but with more power. But that would mean going back. It would mean working within the same broken structure, for the same people who had allowed Micah to run rampant. It would be a victory, but a hollow one. "No," I said quietly. The room went silent. Harrison looked genuinely stunned. "No?" I repeated. "I will not be an employee of this company. My trust in this leadership structure has been broken." However, I added, before he could interrupt, "I am willing to help." A few weeks ago, I incorporated my own firm, Ethereal Consulting. I slid a single, clean white business card across the polished table. It stopped directly in front of Harrison. "My firm can be retained to oversee the successful deployment of the Ether 3.0 update and to train a new internal team on the proper architectural protocols. We can also consult on stabilizing your relationships with the clients who have paused their services." I leaned back in my chair. "My terms are non-negotiable. My firm will be paid a significant project fee, and we will require a monthly retainer for ongoing support. My team, the team I choose, will have full autonomous control over the Ether platform for the duration of the project. And my first condition, before any contract is signed, is the immediate and permanent removal of Micah Thorne from any position of influence over the Ether platform or its personnel." Every eye in the room swiveled to Micah. He looked like he had been slapped. He opened his mouth to speak, but Harrison cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. The chairman picked up my card. He looked at it, then looked at me. He saw the new reality. He saw that I wasn't asking for my old job back. I was offering to save his company, but on my terms. I wasn't Aubrey the employee anymore. I was Aubrey the sovereign power. "Micah," Harrison said, his voice flat and final, "please wait outside." Micah stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He didn't look at anyone. He just walked out of the room, a ghost leaving his own haunting. I didn't watch him go. It wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration. The scene shifts. It's a month later. I'm not in a basement and I'm not in a glass box. I'm in a bright, airy office with large windows that overlook the city. The walls are white, the furniture is modern and minimalist, and the air smells of new beginnings. This is the headquarters of Ethereal Consulting, my company. Across the table from me sits Chloe. She isn't my mentee anymore. She's my director of engineering, my first hire. She looks different. The fear and uncertainty are gone from her eyes, replaced by a quiet confidence. We are on a large video screen, talking to Arthur Sterling. He's smiling, a rare and welcome sight. We aren't just talking about fixing the old Ether. We're showing him the wireframes for Ether 4.0, a complete reimagining of the platform that my new firm is being paid handsomely to develop. This is what we were waiting for, Arthur says, nodding at the screen. This is innovation born from understanding, not from a marketing slogan. It's good to have the architect back at the drafting table, Aubrey. The quiet, profound satisfaction of that moment is something I will never forget. It was vindication, pure and simple. Micah was gone, of course. The board had fired him for cause the same day as that final meeting. The story was that he resigned to pursue other opportunities. We all knew the truth. He hadn't been defeated by a rival. He had been defeated by his own arrogance, by a system that was designed to expose it. He was a bug, and the system had, with my help, corrected itself. On my clean white wall, there is only one piece of art. It's a simple black frame. Inside, it is a printout of Micah's original press release, the one where he announced his quantum leap forward and took credit for my work. I kept it. It's not a trophy. It's not a reminder of him. It's a reminder for me. It's a reminder that a name on a piece of paper means nothing compared to the name that is invisibly etched into the foundation of the work itself. It's a reminder of the difference between claiming value and creating it. They will try to erase you. That's what you need to understand. In your career, in your life, you will encounter people like Micah. People who see your work, your passion, your dedication, not as an asset to be valued, but as a resource to be consumed. They'll call you legacy. They'll call you difficult when you stand up for quality. They'll try to erase your name from the blueprint and put their own on it, hoping no one will notice the difference. But here is the secret they will never understand. They can't erase the foundation. They can't steal the architecture. Because your name, your real worth, isn't in the press release or on the door of the office. It's carved into the steel frame of the thing you built. It's in the logic of the code, the trust of the client, the respect of the people you mentored. That is a fortress they can never conquer. The real dead man's switch isn't a hidden line of code or a secret key. It's your integrity. It's your network of allies, built on mutual respect, not fear. It's the quiet, unshakable knowledge of your own competence. Your real power doesn't come from the title they give you. It comes from the value you create. Never let them convince you otherwise. Your work is yours. Your worth is yours. Don't wait for them to recognize it. Build your own reality, on your own terms. If this story felt real to you, if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or had your work stolen by someone with a better title, tell me about it in the comments below. It's important to know that we're not alone in these fights. Your stories give strength to others, and if you believe in the power of competence over charisma, and you want to see more stories of quiet, strategic vindication, do me a favor. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own worth, and be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because the world has enough loud, empty promises. It's time for the architects to own the conversation.